tonight. They're drawn to present pollinator and native plants at the Nature Discovery Center that is located at Russ Pitman Park in Bellaire. And the center is dedicated to preserving a 4-acre nature park and leading programs that ignite appreciation for nature for all ages. Eric will discuss what the center has done for pollinators and Native Pollinator Garden, and this is the intriguing sentence, and common but possibly not well known pollinators. And one of the things I found off the website, there are just adorable things for kids. I mean, this is a great place to take your kids, your grandkids, your next door neighbor. It was just charming. But they did have one mention for adults that I have to mention. It's called the Adult Messmakers. And it cites that you make bubbles, you play with foam, and they do bubble experiments while drinking mimosas and cold beer. Eric has been at the Discovery Center for 19 years. He's a primary educator. He teaches the preschool, the junior, elementary. He likes to develop unique classes for people that are being homeschooled. And he leads hikes, gives nature-related presentations, items here, and developing the Discovery Room exhibits, which I've heard are also quite lovely and interesting. Eric has been an environmental educator, a naturalist at Armand Bayou Nature Center, the Houston Zoo, Moody Gardens, the Tucson Research Refuge in Maryland, the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary in southern Florida, and the Sasha Lodge on the Napo River in Ecuador. Okay, and he has fieldwork experience. He's done lawn surveys of all kinds of things, turtles, birds, sharks. And the one that was very fascinating to me was he was doing monitoring of the king eyer on the Arctic tundra in Alaska. So you need to look that up. When he's not at work, his activities, but himself at work, he likes to work with herpetology, wildlife pollinator gardening, science blogging, entomology, bird watching, hiking, baking, vegetarian cooking, and social activism. So, if you can't figure out some way to chat with him, you're not trying very hard. But there's more. And I was going to mention that we had given him a grant a couple of years ago. But he also, when I talked to him on the phone, I had a lovely conversation with him. Oh, this is where it comes in. I warned him. He was a restless senior in high school, and he decided to put some of his energy. He went to Clear Lake High School, which is, right across the street. He started riding his bike down the Armand Bayou and got embraced by all the people there that were involved in the place. When he started, he was cleaning bathrooms. But as time went by, they started pulling me in that direction. And one thing I liked when he said, at the end of the senior year, he needed some money. He needed a job that paid. So he turned in his resignation, and they went, whoa, you're not doing that. And they figured out a way to fund him, which I thought was pretty nice. This Saturday, I just so happened that I was in Armand Bayou, and I was talking to some of the folks that actually knew him, and they gave me a couple little nuggets. And one was that they remembered Eric fondly, and that he was a very hard worker. And the other gal said that you could watch Eric getting smarter by the minute.
Yeah, so I grew up at Armand Bayou Nature Center, basically, and it's where I learned how to be a biologist, and I just stuck with a lot of the other team volunteers who were going there at the time enough to do something that paid better, but I followed my passion, which was that. I've been around to a lot of places, and those usually last like 7 months here, 3 months here, 4 months there, a year here, 7 months there. And then I was working at Moody Gardens about 19 and a half years ago, which was a horrible place to work, but we won't get into that. I was working at Moody Gardens, writing curricula for other people to teach. So I was working in a cubicle every day as an environmental educator. And then I saw that there was a job at this place in Bellaire that I'd been bird watching to back in the mid-90s. And I thought, you know what? They had health insurance. That sounds great. So I thought I'm going to be there a couple of years and then I'll move on to something else. I didn't really want to do something that was mostly education with a bit of biology here and there, because I've always done both. I've gone back and forth. But something about this small place where you can watch nature change over the seasons, and you can get to know these entire families of people that live in the neighborhood there as they walk through the park, come to the programs. I just kept telling myself, well, I'll live another. And so now it's been 19 years. So I always kind of knew once I found Armand Bayou Nature Center as a senior in high school, when I went there with my mom one weekend, I watched a man named Bob Smither, who some of you may know, and he was showing people turtles. And I just remember looking at the turtles and thinking, that's what I want to do. So I want to tell people about turtles or something like that. So most of my background professionally, as far as zoology goes or wildlife biology, has been with ornithology, study of birds, or has been in some aspect of restoration ecology. So doing prairie burns, doing transects to see what species are there, or has been in herpetology. I've done a lot of just looking for reptiles and counting them all. We're doing amphibian call counts, which is where you go to different sites and you have to identify them by call and then figure out how many of them are calling, et cetera. But I have a deep love of entomology. I am not an entomologist. I have a degree in biology. I am a biologist. I consider myself a wildlife biologist. I am a naturalist more than anything. I like the broad spread of studying nature and doing nature studies. But I have a keen and deep interest in entomology, and it is actually what got me into gardening, is that I wanted to garden for native pollinators and other creatures. From the moment I started gardening when I was 16, the only reason I was doing it was because I wanted to attract animals into the yard, right? So this is not going to be an entomology course this evening. Most of the talk, I'm going to concentrate just on common pollinators that come into our park that will probably come into your gardens at home, but you may not know what they are. If you know a lot about insects, this may not be new for you. Maybe I'm hoping you'll learn a few new things. I'm just going to kind of do a survey of a bunch of things that come into our park. Let's make it a conversation, so feel free to interrupt me and ask questions if you want to. We do have a bouncer here if you get out of control. But I'm going to show you a little bit about the park, and then we'll get into what our pollinators are. I'll try to keep it to about an hour. So I do want to tell you one thing, too, about frostweed. I'm so glad you picked that one. It grows like at the edges of forests, the edges of meadows, and a lot of people ignore it because there are parts of the year it doesn't have flowers. It is a massively important plant for wasp pollinators. I know the wasps sting us and it hurts and we don't like it, but they are really important pollinators. They're very undervalued. And they love shaggy white flowers. They love things in general like boneset, other kind of white eupatoria and things like that, things that look like boneset. They love frostweed too. And you can find all kinds of crazy wasps all over frostweed. If you are not sure how to landscape for wasps and you're interested in it, look out Heather Holmes' work. She has a big book called Wasps, which is a little expensive, but man, it's a great book. And she also has a website with sheets that you can print out for free and give out to each other or at your organization if it's educational, that tells you what to plant for certain wasp species. And you notice certain plants get mentioned again and again and again. And so boneset, which, we have one usually, I think, called late boneset here, and frostweed are mentioned again and again. They're really important plants for wasp pollinators. All right, let's start with the pictures. I'm going to kind of step aside.
I work at a place called the Nature Discovery Center. Back in the 1980s, a woman named Hannah Ginsbarg, whose name you may have heard of before. She's responsible for the first job I ever had and the current job I have. She was no longer involved with Armand Bayou, and we're just going to leave it at that. And so she was living in Bellaire and noticed there were no city parks in Bellaire. So she started looking around for land to buy to turn into a park. And during that process, she thought, well, I'd already started one nature center, Armand Bayou. I might as well start another one in this little park. So the group is called the Friends of Bellaire Parks. And they looked around, they raised $2 million, and they bought an estate that was about 4 acres, maybe a little bit under. And just like Armand Bayou, they gave it to another more permanent entity with the absolute right to stay on it for 99 years for $1 a year, basically, which is what Armand Bayou does too, by the way. The county actually owns Armand Bayou land. So, the 99 years is not up yet, thankfully. So we bought it. We gave it to the city of Bellaire. It was turned into a park. We were allowed to occupy the old house there. And slowly over the years, we did one more program and one more program. And we were allowed to move from the upstairs of the old house to the downstairs and occupy the whole house. And then to move out in the park and start doing things in the park. And then eventually the city of Bellaire just saw that it was less effort and money on their part if they just let this nonprofit that had become the Nature Discovery Center run the park. So there are other parks now in the city of Bellaire since then, and they are more recreational parks. We are still a city park and we have to allow certain kinds of recreation, but we run it as a green space. One of the things we're trying to do is turn it into a series of mini microcosmic sort of habitats, of small ecosystems, because of course, Bellaire 200 years ago would have all been tall grass prairie, right? But we can't let the entire park be tall grass prairie. So there's an eastern forest section, there's a large, I think it's large, it's really not. There's a decent sized pocket prairie there. And then there's a series of wetland spaces that are natural. And we have a bunch of native plant gardens. You can see our entrance there, which is of course packed with Gaillardia, which is one of my favorite plants because it's covered in insects most of the time. We are in an old house and we've just kept the same house that the Henshaw family lived in from 1927. The house was actually built in 1925, but from 1927 until the house was bought sometime in the early 80s. We're still in that house. It's a very charming little place. We do a lot of nature and science education there. Our whole mission is to connect people to nature, basically. So there's a bunch of different ways to do that. I can teach you all the different species of wasp and what family they're in, or I can just take you outside and we can meditate in the forest or something like that. So we try to scaffold what we're doing, right? And do things for all sets of learners. And because it's only 3 acres and we're surrounded by neighborhood, it is a very non-threatening place for kids and for just people in general who are not used to being out in nature to get more connected to it. Whereas if you get out in the middle of a forest, not everybody's going to be comfortable in that particular setting. And I learned that at Armand Bayou. To me, I'm totally fine being in the middle of a forest at night. And some people, even being out in the middle of the forest in the daytime, will constantly talk about some creature eating them. You know, it's Armand Bayou, buddy. It's not Yellowstone. We are a very popular for a number of things. Since the beginning of the Nature Center, we've been pulling out non-native plants that were part of the original estate, and we've been trying to load it up with native plants. And so if you come out, you could walk out if it's been raining a lot on a spring day in April, and you might see 60 species of native wildflowers blooming in the park. Of course, that's artificial. We planted them. Or we allow volunteers, we plant them, we seed, we do all kinds of different things, but we try to make it just dreamlike when you're walking through in April and May. And it is a really beautiful place. We seem to be a very popular place for spring and fall bird migration. So this is a Blackburnian warbler, a male Blackburnian, one of my favorite birds. There are a lot of bird watchers that come to the park. We also have, for some reason, we attract a lot of owls, specifically eastern screech owls. Not the original landowner, but the family that was there the longest, Frank Henshaw, who was the mayor of Bellaire for 2 years back in the 1920s, he loved trees. And so he planted a lot of trees. It was originally a pecan plantation before it was sold off as private land. And so we are loaded with pecans, different kinds of oaks. Marianne Boschman, who was a staff member there from the very beginning, back in the 80s, who just recently retired a couple of years ago, has done everything she can to build an understory under these trees so that it's not just an open city park, but it's an actual like East Texas woodland style forest, has really packed it full. And the birds appreciate it. As you know, the more native plants you have, the more insects you have, and the more insects you have, the more insect feeders you have, and then the more predators that eat those things. So you can build an ecosystem off of all kinds of native plants. And oaks, I've been reading Doug Tallamy's book, by the way. Oaks. Try to get a lot of oak diversity on your property if you can. We have quite a lot on our small 4 acres. One of my favorite parts of the Nature Center, and some of your money, by the way, went to putting in some more native plants into this section, is our pocket prairie. The pocket prairie was started 10 years ago, maybe? Maybe it was a little bit more than that. And it involved going out to prairies that were pristine, that were about to be destroyed. Some of you may remember the whole Psalms Prairie thing. There were prairies that are now parking lots or car dealerships or movie theaters, and they're gone forever. So there are small sections of virgin prairie that we will never get back. And one of the things that we did is we would go out and gather plants, gather seeds, along with people from the Coastal Prairie Conservancy and the Katy Prairie Conservancy. We would go out and also just dig up big plugs of earth and put them in the back of a pickup truck, drive them to the center, and put the whole plug down into a big hole in the ground. And the seed bank was already there in the soil, along with a lot of other things. This is one of my favorite parts of the park. in late spring, it is just absolutely crawling with insects, small lizards. And putting this into our park actually greatly increased the biodiversity of the park. I noticed lots of things, mushrooms, insects, birds, everything picked up after that. All right, guys. What I'm here today to talk to you mostly about are insect pollinators. And I'm going to show you some different insect pollinators that I hope you don't know at least some of them. So we're not going to get into, things that are vertebrates or other things like that. I want to concentrate mostly on insects today. And then I'll be back next week. You guys are going to be here next week, right? To talk about the other things. That talk will be 3 hours, though, so be prepared. So we'll start off with the bees. For so many people, the only bees they know, right, are the Western honeybee, right? The introduced bee that is found everywhere. I do not care about conserving them. I don't care about hive collapse. I don't care about the mites. They're not native. They do a lot of agricultural work for us, and that's great because I still want to eat almonds and drink orange juice and have avocados. But what I am most interested in is conservation for native bees. The native bees are what are really in trouble. This is the American bumblebee. It is the bumblebee you are most likely to see in your garden. And it's the only one we get with any regularity up in Bellaire in our park. So the American bumblebee in the South is doing okay. It might be threatened in a few states in the South, but in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, 90% of its population has disappeared. And this has happened for a number of reasons: overuse of pesticides, as well, especially neonicotinoids, but also these are ground nesting bees, right? And when foot traffic or vehicles are being driven over those ground nests, they get crushed and compacted. So a combination of these two things, development or habitat loss and degradation, and the overuse of pesticides, has greatly impacted these bees. Again, thankfully in the South, they've seemed to have done a lot better. And I'm not sure it's completely understood why. But it could be that agricultural practices in the Northeast might have something to do with it versus agricultural practices in the South, but we're not 100% sure. Of course, bumblebees are furry all over. Like I said, they nest in the ground. They do have queens, and you could even get 2 rounds of mating and offspring production in the South. And they basically last until you get a freeze. And then right before that, the new queens born this year burrow into the ground. They wait for next spring. And the old queens and the males and the workers all just sort of stay active until you get a freeze, and then they drop dead when it turns cold. So, yeah, I know. But most bees don't live even a year, unless you're the queen bee of some kinds of eusocial bees, of some like colonial bees that have a queen. Like the queen bees of honeybees can live up to 10 to 15 years, right? Whereas the workers might live 10 to 14 days long and then drop dead. Most insects, though, don't live that long. So a lot of times I'm out in the garden, and what's most common, both in my backyard in the Heights and in our park in Bellaire, are not, we do see them a lot, but is another big fat bee that kids or people that don't know maybe animals that well will call bumblebees, but they're not bumblebees. There's another big fat group of bees. This one is one of the smaller ones called the carpenter bees. And carpenter bees, like most bees, actually have really well-developed mandibles. This one is a rarer one in our area, but we've been getting them a lot more recently in the park and even in my own yard. I'm not sure what's going on. It's called Strand's carpenter bee, and they're usually light brown or kind of blonde looking, especially the males. And carpenter bees burrow into wood. So sometimes they'll do it in a big group. Sometimes they'll do it in a solitary way. Most of the bees we're going to talk about, by the way, do not have a queen and worker sort of structure. Most bees are solitary bees, meaning that the female and the male, they'll sometimes hang out with each other after mating, but usually the female goes off and makes her own nest and doesn't nest in a group. I'll show you a few of the ones that do, though. Probably the most common carpenter bee you're going to see in your yard is the eastern carpenter bee. You can't tell it very well on this one, but carpenter bees, even though they're built big and stout like bumblebees, usually have a naked abdomen. So the abdomen is usually not very furry. For some reason, the way this person took the picture, it looks furrier than it is in this picture, but usually they have a shiny sort of non-furry abdomen, and the front has most of the fur on it. So, of course, that fur's made out of chitin. It's part of their exoskeleton. It's not made out of keratin like your own hair. This is the most common. It's called the eastern carpenter bee. This is the one quite often also that gets up in your face if you enter a garden. The males who will have a white patch on the front of their face, they look like they have a little white or cream-colored nose, will come up and check you out. But you notice, I don't know anyone, this doesn't mean it's never happened, but I don't know anyone that's been stung by them. The males actually do not have stingers with carpenter bees, and the females do. And this might actually be, I haven't researched it enough, but it might be common for actually lots of groups of bees and wasps, that males often do not have stingers with a lot of these species. I need to look more closely at each species with that, though. But I do know that with carpenter bees, the males don't have stingers, so there's nothing to be afraid of. If they come up and get in your face, they're just checking you out to see who just entered their territory. They will often establish a territory right outside of the nesting holes of females. I get them nesting at the edge of my carport because we have a big wooden beam that goes all the way around, and they kind of make little holes in there. Those holes are usually about maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch in diameter. And all the bees we are looking at, by the way, they are pollen and nectar eaters, all of them. So this is a smaller bee. It's about the size of a honeybee, but it's a small, shiny black bee with little yellow stripes. This one has a crazy name, the horsefly-like carpenter bee. Let me say that again, horsefly-like carpenter bee, Xylocopita banniformis. I just say that to myself over and over in the car sometimes. And to some people, there are certain aspects of their furry little legs that look like, very much like if you look up closely at a horsefly. So they're called the horsefly-like carpenter bee. I think that's another horsefly-like carpenter bee. And there's a big shiny black one. The whole thing is shiny black, called the southern carpenter bee. And so the southern carpenter bee is very solitary. That big first one that I showed you that was yellow and black, the eastern, they'll sometimes nest in little colonies together. This one doesn't like to be around other carpenter bees, so they are just solitary nesters. They try not to nest near the others. So if they're not nesting in your carport, or they're not making holes in your chicken coop or in your fence, they're finding, of course, dead wood on trees to make their holes. They're burrowing them in. Now, by the way, these holes can become important for other wasps and bees later, because like woodpeckers do, they'll make the nest that year and then abandon it the next year. Sometimes they will reuse the nest, but they'll often make new nests. And those holes burrowed into wood are very important for a lot of other insects. You recognize this one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is, of course, the bee that we see more than anything is the western honeybee. We get a ton of those. This is the standard bee that most people think of when they think of bees, right? And a lot of different bees make honey. It doesn't all taste the same. It's not just the honeybee that does it. You may remember that there was a big scare starting back in the 90s that we were getting Africanized killer bees. And there have been a few incidents here and there. There was a gentleman mowing his lawn in San Antonio back in the late 90s, early 2000s, who did get killed by them. He had a heart attack when he was being attacked by them. He didn't actually die from the stings, but it turned out not to be that big a problem. We didn't end up getting as many Africanized nests as we thought we would. And the Africanized nests that are usually hybridized, by the way, they're not fully Africanized, African honeybees, ended up not being as aggressive as we were afraid they were going to be. So that's why you just don't hear about them anymore. We've even had them checked in our park. Most of the nests we have in our park have no Africanized DNA in them, and they're just European honeybees for the most part. We get them nesting a lot in nest boxes that we put up for the screech owls. So we didn't intend to have bee nests in our park, or at least not native bee nests, but we ended up with a lot of them, and we just sort of leave them because it's a great educational opportunity to show kids. You can just see this whole thing above the ground, about 16 feet off the ground at work. Now, there is a bee, it's all shiny and black, and it looks like a carpenter bee, but it's a leafcutter bee. And leafcutter bees, you might know them for cutting off small sections of leaves. They're often kind of half moon shaped, or some species make a sort of almost completely round shape that goes flat at the edge of the leaf. I noticed that in our park, they really like to cut pieces off of frostweed. They really seem to love quite a lot green ash and redbud. So that may be another thing you're considering when you're landscaping with native plants, is what some native bees might use for nesting materials. So these bees will either chew a hole in a relatively soft, hollow stem of a plant, which is another reason, by the way, why it is really important not to cut everything back before winter. I like to leave a lot of dead plant stems standing in our native plant gardens so that native bees can have a place to nest. And it could be that if you're cutting them back, you're literally taking their babies and throwing them away in the garbage or burning them or composting them. So a lot of those dead stems are being used by leafcutter bees and mason wasps and other things like that. Now, by the way, they also will they'll make their little nests inside of the old holes of carpenter bees. And what they'll do is they'll climb in, they will lay an egg, they'll put down some pollen and a little bit of nectar in a little plug for the baby to feed on. Then they'll wrap that little section of the tube that they've gone into, whether it's inside a stem or inside of an old bee nest, they'll basically use their spit, which is kind of sticky, and they'll make a little cocoon for the baby out of cut leaf pieces. There's even a species, I think it's European, that uses flower petals. You should look that up when you get home. So these beautiful little multicolor sleeping bags for the babies. Then they'll wall it off and they'll put another baby and put another baby. Depending on the species, some species put one baby per nest. Some species will sort of load them in there. And so there are different kinds of leaf cutters. This is the carpenter mimic leaf cutter bee. It's a bee, again, about the size of a honeybee. It's relatively small. And because they're all shiny and black all over, to some people, they look like a tiny carpenter bee. Yes, ma'am. When is it safe to start cutting back a lot of this stuff in your yards, especially if you live maybe in a home that has a homeowners association, or there's just other people around that, your neighbors will poo-poo what you're doing? What I would say is you want to leave it up if you can until early April, at least early to mid-April. And I do understand, like, I'm not in charge of you. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying that it is best practice for native bees and wasps to leave as many stems standing for as long as you can. We were asked if we could just take these cut stems and kind of put them in a pile out of sight, and would the larvae still do well eventually hatching out? I think some things, if they're crawling out, won't do well in the pile, but some things might be able to. Probably what you're going to get is at least more successful offspring out of that than if you cut them down and threw them in a garbage can or burned them or composted them, right? So even if you cut them and then put them in a pile out of the way, that's better than totally removing them. The best thing you could do is leave them up as long as you can, at least into April. But I understand that you can't all do that, right? So even we get people complaining about it, and we have to put up little signs that explain why we're doing what we're doing. So, print up a sign, put it in your yard, tell people while you're doing what you're doing. There's a whole group of little leafcutter bees that look like this, and you really cannot tell them apart. So I believe this one is the flat-tailed carpenter bee, but it might be another species, because a lot of them, you have to get them and look at them under a microscope or a hand lens and look at, does it have a bifurcating tarsus or that kind of weird stuff? You have to look at leg structures and where the hairs come out between the abdominal sections and just weird stuff like that. So a lot of leafcutter bees, you just have to look at them and go, that's a leafcutter bee. I believe this one is Xylocopa mendicus, but I might be wrong. This one is actually called the sharp-tailed bee. It's another kind of leafcutter. It's also called the cuckoo bees. They are brood parasites. They will lay their eggs on the nests of other bees, and the young will climb out and eat the babies and the nectar and pollen plug that's in their nest. So kind of nasty. But you see where they get the name cuckoo, right? So they're called either sharp-tailed bees or cuckoo bees, and they're another group of leafcutter bees. This is one called a pebble bee, and pebble bees make the loveliest little nests, either inside of another bee's hole from last year or the previous years, or even sometimes on the side. They will get small, tiny little pebbles and using their saliva, glue them together and make a little pebble cocoon for their babies. So the same thing that the leaf cutters do, they do it, but they do it by gluing together tiny little multicolored pebbles. It's whatever kind of crushed granite or whatever kind of pebbles or sand you have available near you, that's what they'll use in your garden. So sometimes you'll see this strange little multicolored pebble structure kind of glued to the side of a plant. That's what it is. It's from a pebble bee. And this is another bee. It's a little bit thinner and smaller than a honeybee. We also get two common species of sweat bees in our park. Most sweat bees are tiny little black bees. They're called that because they will sometimes land on you and sop up sweat off of your skin, or they'll land in the corner of your eye and try to get the tears off of your eye. They feed on people's tears. Actually, these were a big problem when I was guiding in Ecuador in the rainforest. Whenever you would go up in the bird watching towers above the canopy, all of a sudden your eyes would fill up with tiny bees, and you'd have to just sit there like that the whole time. They weren't trying to sting you. They were trying to steal your tears. But the larger, the ones called the metallic green bees, don't do that. They're in the same family, but these are usually ground nesting bees. They're often very colorful. Sometimes the males will have stripes on them and the females will be all green. This is one called the brown-winged striped sweat bee. They nest underground. They're not very social, so they'll often kind of nest apart from each other. I often find these guys nesting. We have a fountain in the park that dates back to when it was a yard, and there's bricks laid down around the fountain, and there's sand packed in between the bricks. And you'll see these guys making little nests in the sand between the bricks. And if you just sit there in the summer next to the fountain, you'll see this little green bee coming and going, coming and going. This group is sometimes in the tropics called the orchid bees because they often have relationships with native orchids in Central and South America. The next bee, which is even greener, I think it's really beautiful. And these are, again, about the size of a honeybee, is called a metallic epauletted sweat bee. And they are also lone nesters nesting in the ground, and they make these really intricate branching tunnel systems. I think they're really pretty. This is one of my favorite bees. If you're a bird watcher and you want to see these, go in fall to the Hawk Watch site at Smith Point. And don't go up on the thing. Walk out to the edge of the field there, right up against the bay. And there's all these flowers, especially tie vine, growing there. And you'll see these bees coming and going from the tie vine, which is one of our native morning glories. There's another picture of one. I think an absolutely beautiful bee. This is just aesthetically, this is my favorite group of bees. An underappreciated group of pollinators. They're not the best pollinators because they don't necessarily have bodies built for it always. They're very slick looking, are beetles. And a lot of people don't like this beetle. Do you guys know who this is? If you're trying to grow watermelons or you're trying to grow squash or pumpkins, this is the spotted cucumber beetle. They eat the roots of cucurbits, everything that's in that family. They're a very common beetle here. They're not the only one of the cucumber beetles. We have a couple of others. But as adults, they are slightly predatory, sometimes, eating other insects, but they really, really love nectar and pollen. So they're not super efficient pollinators, but they are also pollinators. So we have the spotted cucumber beetle, and we have the banded cucumber beetle. And right here on the right with the spotted is the striped cucumber beetle. They're about the size of a small ladybug, these beetles. And you can see the striped is even smaller. People often mistake them for a ladybug. But one of the things to look for with ladybugs is they take their head, they often put it underneath their thorax shield, their thoracic shield, their pronotum. So they'll often have their head ducked, whereas leaf beetles, like the cucumber beetles, will have their heads more outstretched. So even though it's spotted, you can kind of see from a few things that this is not a ladybug. It's one of the cucumber beetles. Another one of my favorites. I love beetles, guys. And not everybody loves these because their babies, their larvae live underground and eat plant roots. And they can become somewhat epidemic on certain kinds of trees. I've noticed just personally, and I've read in a few books, that they're very closely related with magnolia trees. This is the green June beetle. They're kind of metallic. They can have a bronzy wash. Sometimes that's missing. Sometimes they're almost completely bronzy looking, but they usually have that white or cream colored border. There's another one kind of to the west side of town called the fig eater, which you may have heard of. So as babies, as larvae, they eat the roots of trees. And then, when they hatch out, and what's weird? It really does depend, regardless of what books say, it really does depend on the weather and how much rainfall you've had, because I've noticed sometimes they're everywhere in April, and some years they're not out until the fall. So we have such a long fall and a long spring here that a lot of animals that would normally be dying up north from frost, they have a lot more flexibility down in the south, right? So there's a lot of things that can just wait if they need to. But you'll notice they'll come out in huge numbers all of a sudden. It is a great big beetle about the size of, kind of bigger than a quarter. The size of a 50-cent piece, if you remember what that looks like, kind of, as far as its length. They're big bumbling beetles, and when one flies by you, you sometimes think a bumblebee has gone by you. They have this big clumsy flight. They'll bang into things. One of the things that's awesome is they'll hatch out inside of our live possum cage outside. but the mesh in that cage is made so that a raccoon hand can't go through and pick at any of our animals. So the beetles can't get out either. The possum will be walking around totally confused, trapped in there with 20 beetles. So we'll have to go in every morning and set these beetles free. They love big, open, creamy looking flowers. They eat fruit and they eat the juices of plants like sap, but they also like nectar and pollen. Sometimes they will destroy the structures at the bottom of a plant feeding on it, but they will often pollinate things like magnolias and closely related plants. There's another picture of one up close. It's called the green June beetle, or the metallic green June beetle. Another group of beetles that I've been finding a lot in flowers, both at our park and just kind of around, is the margined leatherwing beetle. They like prairies and grasslands a lot, but I notice them in my garden in the Heights too, and I don't live in the middle of a prairie. They're predatory and they're nectar feeders. So they will prey on other creatures they find in flowers, and they will also eat them. It's a small creature, maybe about an inch long, thin looking, and they are just mating all the time everywhere. So you're more likely to find them paired up than you are alone, kind of all over the place. This one is called the sand chafer, and I've been finding those a lot in our park too. What's strange is sand chafers like kind of big open flowers. Now in Memorial Park, which is near us, I find these during the day, but for some reason, I've never seen a sand chafer in the daytime. It's another kind of scarab beetle. They like big open flowers because they're big, clumsy beetles. They're basically a June bug, so they're about the size of the average June bug that would visit the lights outside your house. In our park, for some reason, I only see them on nighttime insect surveys in our park, where we put up a big white sheet and we shine light on it and we attract insects. That's the only time I see them in our park. I don't know what they're doing the rest of the time, but they have to be feeding on their daytime nectar feeders. So I'm not sure what's going on in our particular park. One of my favorite flower scarabs is the Delta flower scarab, because they have this really beautiful, it looks like the Greek symbol for Delta on their back. This is another one that likes to feed on both pollen and nectar. And again, a lot of these beetles will destroy the nectary at the bottom of a flower feeding on it, but they don't always do it. And they're pretty good on their legs and the underside of their bodies. They're a little furrier and they're better at carrying the pollen there. Now, when you have a lot of composites in your garden, and I have to admit, I am personally composite crazy. So I don't know why. I like the floral structure of composites. And so I try to pack in as many native composites into my garden. But even just walking through a field at Armand Bayou, in your own garden, St. Julian's Crossing, if you've ever been there, up in the Heights, there's all these different places. When you have a lot of composites, or if you see in the wild, especially a lot of fleabane growing, walk up and look very closely at it. And there is a teeny tiny little beetle that's less than a centimeter long called a tumbling flower beetle. And they come in different colors. It can be very different to tell the species apart because they're very tiny, and sometimes it's structural differences. You know what genus they're in, like that's Mordella or Mordellina or something like that, but it's really hard to tell them apart. They're teeny tiny little beetles, and sometimes you might need to use your phone's camera function so that you can kind of zoom in on it, or if you walk around with a magnifying glass when you're naturalisting, look very closely at this little black thing in a composite, and it's often not a gnat like you might think it is from far away. It's a tiny little beetle. And they have this stylus that sticks off the back of their abdomen, and if you get too close, they smack it down on the surface, and it basically catapults them off of the surface. They appear to tumble off of the flower. And what's really fun is if a whole bunch of flowers growing together has a bunch of them, and you get close and put your hands out, and they all go in a bunch of different directions like confetti. The first place I ever noticed them, do you guys know who Don Verser is? Some of you do. He has found a lot of the prairies around town that are now protected. He's retired and trying to enjoy his life now. But he was a longtime volunteer at the Nature Discovery Center. He's done a lot of prairie work, and I think I was walking around with Don during a prairie tour out in the middle of the big thicket. We were going through one of those little sections of mini prairie that grows in the middle of the piney woods, which is a very specific kind of prairie. And there were a bunch of these growing on whatever species of fleabane were there. And it's one of those things that once I noticed them for the first time, now I see them all the time, which means I must have been walking by them for years and years. They're really all over the place where you have composites, even on the side of the road next to White Oak Bayou in the Heights, where I walk all the time. There's other species that can be very pretty, but you still see on all those species that stylus. There's a technical word for it that I can't remember, but it's sticking off the back of the abdomen there. And that's what they catapult themselves with. Okay, we have to talk about butterflies, right? So what I'm going to do is something that you might already know. I didn't want to make this a butterfly talk, but then I added a bunch of butterflies because I love butterflies. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm just going to kind of show you the butterflies that show up in our park, not spend too long on them, because there are so many speakers that will come to you and talk about butterflies over the years. There's a lot of butterfly books. I just want to remind you not what plants these butterflies feed on, because I'm betting a lot of you have a garden that is packed full with a lot of different kinds of floral structures, a lot of different colors, flower sizes, and types. What I want to encourage with you today is paying attention to larval host plants. The flowers or plants or trees are plants, but that these creatures need to lay their eggs on. Because I don't just enjoy seeing adult butterflies, I love seeing caterpillars in my garden too. And of course, I don't care if they're eating my plants, that's why I put them out there. I'm going to show you a series of butterflies that show up at our park and in my garden there in the Heights. And I'll just go through very quickly and tell you what their native host plants are. Of course, we have the red admiral. This is a migratory butterfly that will often show up down here in the winter. They seem to be more cold tolerant than some other butterflies. The red admirals like nettles and false nettles. Good luck getting that at a garden center. And then there is how do I pronounce this? Seranaus blue, which is a small butterfly that's kind of gray on the underwing, but it is blue on the top wings. They like woody legumes like cassia and mesquite, partridge pea, and the wild indigos. Now, y'all, we love native plants here, right? And we don't like having non-native plants, especially if they're invasive in our yard. At the Nature Discovery Center, we have lawns. And it's not mostly lawns, but we have some lawns. And so what grows on our lawns? White clover. And I know white clover is invasive, and I know it's not native, and we go out. We can't get rid of it. We try. We do go out and we weed eat a lot of it back because we don't want to kill off the herbaceoua that's popping up. If you chop herbaceoua back, prairie nymph, it will not make another flower then. Doesn't make it, that particular plant does not make a flower to the next year. So we go in and delicately remove as much of it before it flowers and seeds, but we always leave a patch. Part of the reason why we leave a patch is there are a lot of small, delicate native butterflies, which absolutely love. Now, the next meeting, you can curse my name, make me persona non grata, never speak to me again, but we do leave a small patch of white clover. By the way, dandelions are way overrated. So whenever you see those memes that say, leave the dandelions in your yard, no, that's great if you live in Europe. Here, we don't need to do that. They're actually low quality nectar. These are high quality nectar flowers, and there's a lot of small butterflies which absolutely love them. So for the blues and the hair streaks, we do, and I'll show you the butterflies I'm talking about, we do leave a small patch of white clover to bloom on the front yard of the Nature Center for these particular animals. It's the same reason why we've left some Mexican shrimp plant in some parts of the park. Also, because it can be hard to comfort. Well, you'll see the butterfly I'm talking about. There's a butterfly that uses it as a host plant, but also it's one of the few things that blooms red in the wintertime for wintering hummingbirds. Anyways, this is the Seranaus blue, small butterfly. It's blue on the top, but you almost never see the blue part. And that's what it looks like on the underwing. So a very different looking butterfly, right? It's a tiny little butterfly, maybe 1.5 inches wide at the most. The common buckeye is another thing we get a lot in the park, especially in the fall. This is another migratory butterfly, but it's also a late eclosing butterfly, which means they come out of their chrysalises late. Buckeyes like to lay their eggs on plantago, which is our wild native plantains. But also, the introduced ones. Ruellia, cudweed, toadflax, and false foxglove. They love those things. The next one is a small butterfly called the pearl crescent, a little showy butterfly, very active. They come in quite a lot of variation as far as how much yellow or orange they have, or whether they're blacker or browner in the dark parts. Pearl crescents usually lay their eggs on different kinds of aster species, but they also lay their eggs on other smooth-leaved composites. Another one is the very closely related Phaon crescent. They love to lay their eggs on frog fruit. Does anybody have frog fruit in their yard? I love frog fruit. I just love the name. I like the way it looks. Lots of small butterflies like to feed on it, especially the checkered skippers. The tropical and white checkered skippers love feeding on it. Another one that doesn't get as much love because it's not quite as colorful, they can grow a little bit bigger, is the Texan crescent. And the Texan crescent likes to lay its eggs on things in the acanthus family. So that means things like Justicia and Ruellia, but they also like to lay their eggs on Mexican shrimp plant. This is the Texan crescent, not the Texas, but the Texan crescent. Moving from small butterflies to larger butterflies, of course, we have both the hackberry emperor and the tawny emperor, and they both lay their eggs on hackberries, a very underrated tree. I know that because they have very soft wood, they don't live very long. A lot of people don't like them. There are so many things that lay their eggs and feed on the leaves and the stems and the petioles of hackberries. I think hackberry is a great native tree, actually. They're not as beautiful as some other trees, but they have so much wildlife use. And a lot of things feed on the berries, too. Sugarberry. Another really common butterfly in this area is the gray hair streak. And gray hair streaks like to lay their eggs on mallows, as well as legumes like clovers and different kinds of beans in your garden. Be honest, does anybody here grow fruits and vegetables in their garden that are not native? Okay. All right, some of us are into it. Yeah. I grow carrots. I like carrots, guys. I like to grow carrots. There's another smaller blue, it's in the blue and hair streak. This one is called, it's a tiny little butterfly, maybe a centimeter and a half wide, called, when it's closed up like this, called the dusky ground streak. And this is the one that absolutely loves white clover. But it also likes other small flowered plants. So if you're thinking, Eric, you're insane, I'm never letting that grow in my yard, just consider that you need a lot of plants that have very small flowers on their florets or things like that. So, another thing, honestly, that frog fruit is good for are small butterflies like these guys. This guy's called the dusky ground streak. And the dusky ground streak likes to lay its eggs down in dead leaves, actually. Another reason to leave some leaf litter in your yard. And the caterpillar crawls through and eats dead leaf material. And it has recently been shown that they're probably also feeding on the myceliae of fungi as well. But their main diet is dead leaf material. So again, another reason to leave some leaf litter down underneath your plants if you can. That shows you the dusky ground streak on the top and on the bottom. They have a little flash of blue, a very tiny little butterfly. Two of my favorite groups. And the very first one, when we moved in our new house back in last February, well, no, I don't know. We've been there a year now. But the first butterfly I saw in my yard was the American lady, and it was sitting on the side. I don't know what attracted them. We have both the American lady and the painted lady in our area. Both of them lay their eggs on composites. American ladies like to lay their eggs on pussy toes and everlasting and ironweed. Does anybody have ironweed in their garden? Yeah, I really like that one. It's in a lot of well put together seed mixes. And then we have painted ladies, which like to lay their eggs on sunflowers and thistles and basket flowers. If you like to grow native passion flowers or even non-native passion flowers, you've probably seen this butterfly in your yard. It is the Gulf fritillary. It's not a true fritillary butterfly. It's in the long wings or the heliconian butterflies. And of course, you guys know that one, right? We try at any one time to have 3 or 4 species of native milkweed growing in our park. And for the first year personally, I have 4 species of native milkweed in my garden. So not all of them might be native to this part of Harris County. I think butterfly weed is only native to northern Harris County, like far northern Harris County, but close enough. I live in the Heights. I live kind of close to the northern part of Harris County. I will tell you, one of the things you may not know about monarch caterpillars, you might know this. Once the caterpillars start feeding on a certain species of milkweed, you cannot move them to a different species. So have plenty of one species for your caterpillars to feed on. If they've laid their eggs on tropical milkweed, you cannot move them to green milkweed or aquatic milkweed or one of those other ones, right? We also have the queen in our area, which is another milkweed butterfly. And the question mark, which likes to lay its eggs on elm, hackberry, and nettles. That's what by the way, that's what a question mark looks like closed, so you might never notice it. Tropical checkered skippers like to lay their eggs on mallows and sida and poppy mallows. Clouded skippers like to lay their eggs on various grasses, including whatever lawn grass you've probably got growing. Horace, there's one called the clouded skip. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the clouded skipper. Horace's dusky wing is not a moth. It's just a brown butterfly. A lot of people think it's a moth. They like to lay their eggs on oaks. Fiery skipper likes to lay its eggs on various grasses. Oh, it's done.